folks, Rod here from Learn to Paint Academy. Welcome to this week's Art Studio tip. Now, I want to talk to you this week about something I think is pretty fundamentally important for those of us who are learning to paint and learning to improve our studio practice. And that is something that we do every week in the Learn to Paint TV episode, which is all about how do you take a photo and turn a photo into a finished painting. And often, so I'll show you, this is a photo that I took. I was hiking out in the west of Maryborough on the Sunshine Coast, or further north of the Sunshine Coast. So this is sort of in the country, right? I hiked up the side of a mountain, took that photo, loved the view. How do I turn that into a finished painting? And this is something having worked with 20-odd thousand beginner painters, it's something I've seen a lot of them struggle with. They have these photos, they're just not sure how to translate the photo into the painting. So the problem is, when you look at the photo, there's so much information and so many details there. What do you do? Where do you start? What do you paint first? What do you paint second? And so on. These are the questions I get often from my students. So in the Learn to Paint TV episodes every week, I break it down for you. And the very first thing that we always look for is, in the photo, what are the big shapes? That's what I want to talk to you about this week. So you can see from this photo here, I've done my own interpretation with the painting, right? There's the painting and there's the photo. So I've modified things to suit myself. But what I did was I started out by asking myself, what are the big shapes in the photo? And if you come over here to the painting, you'll see that, just very roughly, this foreground area here is one big shape, okay? This row of trees here that sits just below that hill is another big shape. Then we've got this distant valley, right? All the grasses is pretty much in drought, so it's starting to dry off. So that's another big shape. The distant mountain range would be a fourth big shape. The sky becomes the fifth big shape. And then we put these trees and things on after we've put in the big shapes, right? That's how I broke this particular painting down into less than half a dozen big shapes. It makes it really easy to get started. So what I'll do, I'll take you to the computer now, and we'll have a look at a few examples of paintings that I've done recently and how I've taken the photo, right? Photo reference, and then turn the photo into a series of big shapes. And then it's a matter of just mapping those big shapes out on the canvas. So let's go to the computer. Okay, so let's look at this photo here. This is a photo from our free course that you can enroll in at the Learn to Paint Academy. So it's one of the projects that we do in the free course. And it's a photo that I took in a location called Montville on the Sunshine Coast in Queensland here. And it's a fantastic subject for learning how to paint landscapes. However, as a beginner or somebody who hasn't been painting a lot and had a lot of experience, when you look at this photo, it's an overwhelming amount of information. And so what I've been teaching in the Learn to Paint TV weekly show is the very first thing you want to do when you look at photo reference like this is to identify the big shapes. And typically what I've found is that there's about 4 to 6 big shapes in a subject. If you've got more than, say, 6, you don't want 15 big shapes, and you don't want 1 or 2, because then you're not breaking the subject down enough. And if you've got 15, then you're getting into too many details. So if we look at this photo here that I took, a couple of things we need to note. And this is what you want to do when you analyze your own photos. If I was to paint it with the same proportions as you see in the photo, I would need a fairly long landscape shaped canvas. Now, most of the time I don't tend to paint in that. So the first thing I did was to decide, okay, well, I'm probably not going to utilize that size canvas, and we don't typically use that in the Learn to Paint TV show. So if I take my pen here, what I basically did was I cropped it down the side there, and then I cropped it around about there. Okay, now these lines aren't great. Apologies for that. However, you get the idea, right? So this window in here is what we ended up painting. So what are the big shapes within this window here? So let's look at them. I'll change the pen color. We'll make it, say, a green. Actually, no, we'll make it a red because the whole subject's green. So the very first thing is we've got a foreground hill here. And this is part of the reason why I think this is such a great subject. So the very first shape is really this hill that runs down the foreground there, and then it runs along the bottom of the canvas. Okay. So I just treat that as one big shape. Now, obviously there's detail in there. There's bits of foliage and so on, and there's a path. But what I want to do is just clump all those details down into one big shape. So ignore those details for the moment. Just say, okay, in terms of getting the right value and color temperature and saturation of the elements that are important for aerial perspective, this is one shape. We can clump all that together into one shape. Okay, so I'll make that number 1. And it's pretty easy to identify when you just look at the fact that there is a foreground hill here. Okay, now sitting on top of that foreground hill, of course, we've got this big tree shape here. Okay, and this is pretty important that you understand how we arrive at these shapes. So we've got these trees here, and these are all at the same sort of distance away from the position where I took the photo. They're all in the same plane, the same distance. Right now, these ones here are a bit bigger, and these ones here are a little bit smaller, but they're all roughly the same plane. So what that means is they are all shape number 2. Okay. Now, from a values perspective and a temperature and a saturation perspective, that's important, because placing those all into shape number 2, so we just treat this as all one big mass with this outline, then we can get our values and our temperature and our saturation lined up for that particular shape there. Okay, so just clump it all together, break details down into a handful of big shapes, and it'll improve your painting dramatically. The next logical line here is we've got this middle distance row of this valley in here. Okay, it's all roughly on the same distance, although it's a little bit closer here and it's a little bit further away there, but that whole shape in there makes for an easy to identify value and temperature and saturation in this valley here. Okay, so that becomes shape number 3. And then shape number 4, we've got this very distant, and you can see it's a bluey grey. So you can see like this section in here is bluey grey, where you've got more green in here. There's more yellow and red showing in here. So this bluey grey section becomes its own shape in there, right? And notice how the shapes are getting smaller and smaller as we go away into the distance. So we've got this bluey grey mountain range right off beyond the middle distance. So shape number 3 is our middle distance. Shape number 4 is our distant mountain range. Now, I've identified 4 big shapes, but what does that mean? It means our sky becomes shape number 5. And look, we don't even have to draw it in. It's already drawn in by virtue of the fact that we've done the other shapes, but I'll just do those edges there, right? That becomes shape number 5. And our sky paints itself virtually, right? So what does that mean? It means when we look at our blank canvas and we've got our photo reference, we know we're going to cut off this section here, and we're going to cut off that section, because our canvas is, usually we use a 16 by 20 inch canvas, and it's going to be roughly that sort of format. Okay, that rectangle format there, rather than this very long format. So we're going to cut off the ends, we're going to identify 4 big shapes, and then we'll start our drawing step. We're going to do that a lot easier than what traditionally people have been taught to draw when they want to paint something. Is we're not going to draw in all the details, we're just going to get the outlines of the big shapes in. And if you can get those outlines of the big shapes in, just these 5 big shapes, we actually only need to identify 4 of them, then you've got the drawing part of it down. And all we're doing in the drawing part, as part of the Moore method of painting, is really just putting the big shapes in the right places. The key, though, is to be able to identify what those big shapes are. So hopefully you can see here how we can take a complex photo and just break that down into 5 big shapes. Okay, so let's now have a look at this recent episode of Learn to Paint TV, which is the waterfall of Obi Obi Creek photo that I took. And I should point out that when I take photos, I tend to take a whole lot of photos. So I probably took 30 photos of the waterfall from different angles and so on. And that way I've got plenty of reference material when I get back to the studio to really sit down and decide which ones to turn into paintings. So again, we're looking for half a dozen maximum big shapes. So to me, the obvious one here is this rock pool. Okay, so this is in the foreground, and this little clump of rocks. This section in here, to me, that is a shape. It's all part of the same shape. Now, within that shape, I've got cool temperatures here, and we've got the warmer temperatures in the rocks. Okay, so you need to be mindful of within one shape you can have different temperatures, potentially different values and so on. But that to me seemed to be one logical shape. The next logical shape was this rock here. Now I know it's all part of the same rock formation, but if you look at this section, it's all in sort of a highlighted manner, and I'll run it say down through to there. I looked at that and I thought, well, that sort of makes an obvious second shape because it's a similar sort of temperature all the way through. It's mostly in highlight, and we've got a little bit of dark just there. But look at all the highlights, on the rocks here. So to me, that was a very similar sort of shape. So that became shape number 2 there. And then shape number 3, of course, was this part of the rock that was in shadow. So all this rest of this rock in here, I treated that as shape number 3. And this tree here, in fact, I think in the episode I probably brought it down like that because the photo printed out a bit darker. So I probably had all of that as shape number 4 there. And that leaves this little section up here as shape number 5. Now that makes logical sense because this section of trees is further away in the distance than this one here. This one here is getting a lot of highlights on the leaves from the sun. This one's got a lot more shadow, but it's further off in the distance, so it's going to be cooler in temperature. So again, when you look at it, we're talking about 5 big shapes. And so it starts to become easy to then to map that out on your canvas. Now, sure, you could argue that perhaps I should have drawn a line through there, and this becomes a shape, and that becomes a shape, and perhaps I could put my lines in different areas. Look, there's no right or wrong. The key is for you to be able to identify big shapes of similar value, similar temperature, and similar saturation levels, so the depth, and being able to just then utilize those outlines of those shapes to be able to map them in onto your blank canvas. And that's the point I really want to try and get across to you here. Okay, so this is our third photo that I'm going to look at here. So we've got 3 very different styles of photo. This is a photo that I took in Montmartre in Paris. It was late in the day, and that's the Sacré-Cœur, the old church sitting up on top of the hill. And around it, you've got all these cobbled alleyways and little cafes and things like that. It's a beautiful part of the world. But the interesting thing about this particular photo is, and if you've seen the episode of Learn to Paint TV where we paint this one, it's a recent episode, you basically have, so what I'll do, I'll do this one slightly differently just to show you. I'll take this blue pen. So you basically have 2 halves to this painting, right? You've got a whole lot of stuff in shadow, and you've got a whole lot in sunlight. So the contrast in this is great, much greater than what we normally do, and I think it makes a really interesting subject to paint. So if I draw everything that's in shadow, an outline here, and if you start to then think of that as being a shape, right? And you can run a line up through the trees there. In fact, you could probably even include that part of the tree there because a lot of that's in shadow as well, right? So technically you could have gone, well, this is shape 1 and this is shape 2, right? Dark shape and then the shapes in light. So that's one way you could approach it. So let me just undo that and that. Okay. So yeah, that you could just treat it as the shapes of darkness and lightness here. I think that would be a valid approach here, right? Or you could do it this way. So pretty much I treated that all as one shape there. And if you've seen the video, you'll understand how I've done that. This tree here is really another shape, okay, in there. So this was 1. Everything in the cafe alleyway side wall. And then this becomes shape number 2 because it needs to be treated slightly differently. You've got, even though there's a lot of shadow in here, there's also all this mid-tone and highlight greens. Then we have shape 3 becomes everything inside this red line here. Okay, and we've sort of already got part of that mapped in already. Okay, and up and around the church. Okay. Now, if you're following what I'm really talking about here, what this means is you don't need, when you're doing your drawing, to draw in all these little details and shadows and little bars in the fencing here, and you don't need to do that. You don't need to draw leaves of trees and things like that. You just want to get the outline in right, and when we block it in, we block in with the right color, the right value, the right temperature, and we're a good distance of the way to actually getting the painting to work if we can get this part right. And then by virtue of the fact that we've done the church outline, it leaves us with our sky. So realistically, this is four big shapes. Now, if you want to be particular and break it down even more, I'll go with the purple here. You could argue that we've got the cafe in there, right? You could argue that's one shape, and these people here are another shape, and these people here are another shape, and you've got an alleyway. You could argue that if you want, but that's starting. Can you see how that's starting to now overcomplicate it, right? And what we're about is simplifying everything right down into a handful of shapes, a handful of colors, a handful of brushes, and it makes your life a lot easier. So, if you go and look at the episode for this one, Montmartre in Paris, it's a recent episode, 65 or 66, right? I've treated it as being one big shape in here, the tree, then the church, and then the sky. So basically it's four big shapes, and I recommend you go and watch that to see how we've approached painting that one as just four big shapes. Okay, well, I hope that explanation on the computer of those three paintings or those three photos has really helped get clear in your mind what you need to do with your photo reference material to be able to identify the big shapes and start your painting off with big shapes. That's the really important thing. If you try and start with details, it'll become a very difficult painting to do. Start with big shapes first, work down to details later on. It'll make your life so much easier. Hope you've enjoyed this week's Art Studio Chat. If you have, please like, comment, share, and subscribe. We really appreciate it. Look out for next week's episode of Art Studio Chat. Cheers for now.